What is Catholicism? Well, as a Catholic kid who grew up in the 1980s and 1990s in St. Barnabas Parish, Bronx, New York, and was educated by the Christian Brothers in grammar school, the Jesuits in high school, and the Jesuits in my university as well, I hope I am qualified to answer this question. I'm going to try. Um, I've always been fascinated with theology and have done a lot of reading on the formation of Christianity in the world and its history and dogmatic and philosophical debates that happened within and outside of the church. It can all get very confusing, but I'm going to try to keep this a little bit distilled and easy to kind of grip hold of. It's hard to sometimes simply put things, especially with so much weight and history behind them. The Catholic Church is the oldest institution in the Western world. Its history can be traced back over 2,000 years to the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. Around Jesus in his life and thereafter was a group of supporters known as disciples. The Jesus movement developed in sophistication, belief, and in numbers of devotees rapidly and reachingly after Jesus' death and resurrection, as his followers claim to have borne witness to. Initially, Jesus' followers operated as a group within Judaism. Okay, so the wellspring of the Catholic Church is very much a Jewish movement. Like a little sect of Judaism in its early days. Their primary distinguishing belief as practicing Jews upon, the foundation of this movement was the Messiah had come, and Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, who was crucified and beat death, rose again, right? Thereby initiating the union of God's kingdom, heaven, and earth. It was very much a messianic movement. Jewish temple worship and Jewish leadership, religious leadership, the Sanhedrin, the Philistines were, it was just hotly discussed and looked after. I mean, the Jews wanted a king to come and release them from the bondage of what was then the Roman Empire. And that king would be a Messiah that would, like I said, twine heaven and earth, God's kingdom and earth. One of the most dynamic and influential people in recorded history, full stop, was a man named Paul of Tarsus, Tarsus being a city in modern-day Turkey, otherwise known as St. Paul. St. Paul had not known Jesus in his life. He was not an original disciple, but went through a storied and miraculous conversion to believe in Jesus's place as Messiah and divinity as the Son of God. And through Paul's proselytizing thereafter, this sect of Judaism became something much more. It appealed to the Gentiles as well as the Jews. So it was a movement now that kind of burst out of just being on the Jewish scene and became relevant for people near and far who were otherwise outside of the fold of Judaism. Paul really, more than anyone, helped stamp the good news or the gospel of Jesus in religious consciousness. Jesus's message really we know best in many ways through the Pauline epistles or letters. They breathed proto-theology and ethics and love, religious love, into the life and teachings of Jesus in a way that the Gospels recorded almost don't. I don't mean to diminish the Gospels, but the Gospels have wonderful things, of course, parables and narrative and dialogue, but you have to read Paul to really, I guess, get what I'm saying, which you should. Matter of fact, I have a quote here. It is by a broadcaster called Edward Stourton, and it's from his 2004 book called In the Footsteps of St. Paul. Paul is the intellectual forebearer of anyone who was brought up in the framework of once Christian Europe. He is one of a handful of towering figures who formed our way of thinking. And when you read his letters, you are going back to your roots. You may not always like what you find, but you cannot get away from the fact that you have inherited Paul's intellectual genes. I mean, pretty emphatic there. If Christianity sits as the bedrock of Western cultural identity, belief structure, morals, civic institutions, that sits on Paul. He did 3 missionary trips, one in the Eastern Mediterranean, one throughout Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and one to Rome for sure, that we know of, mostly. He might have gone farther west from Rome. That's less certain. But he got the let out. He really traveled and created communities, church communities, in a way that Jesus's other disciples did, but not maybe as wide and not as actively. You know, all 12 apostles apocryphally had traveled. Thomas is a good example. People believe that Thomas might have ended up in Chennai in India on the eastern coast of South India. But less is certain about all that than Paul's footprints. For its first millennium, the Catholic Church was the only institution in the Christian world. True and not true. Certainly, if we zoom out from that view, it might seem that way. Like, if you look at that statement maybe from 50,000 feet up and you can't see clearly the activities on the ground, I might forgive you for that. But suffice to say that from the very beginning, Christian theology really grew through differences and problems, questions around what it meant to be a follower of Jesus, how one should affiliate and with whom, how to reconcile Greek or pagan philosophical tradition, for example, Plato, the Stoics, with Christian life, and also with Jewish law. How do those 3 things kind of swirl together? You had different sects of Christianity almost from the very beginning. certainly in the 2nd century AD, but really even towards the end of the 1st century. Some of the big billboard ones would be the Gnostics, the Marcions, many others, localized. Some evidence of this comes up in Paul's letters, where Paul gets hot and bothered about certain religious practice that might have cropped up and been going on in communities that he had previously passed through. And now he hears word that X, Y, and Z is happening. So, the pushing and pulling of early belief certainly influenced the way Christianity galvanized into a monolith. As a matter of fact, this is a good quote. This is, I should attribute this as well. It's by a wonderful author. Let me pull up. I've got so many books going on in here. His name is Justo Gonzalez. As I said, The Story of Christianity, Volume 1, The Early Church to the Dawn of the Renaissance. The original meaning of Catholic Church referred to the episcopal collegiality, as well as with the multiform witness to the gospel in several canonical gospels. The word Catholic means universal, but it also means according to the whole. To separate itself from the various heretical groups and sects, the ancient church began calling itself Catholic. This title underscored both its universality and the inclusiveness of the witness on which it stood. It was the church according to the whole, that is, according to the total witness of all the apostles and all the evangelists. So we get this term Catholic in response to a lot of the fracturing or the kind of wrestling that was going on as to who kind of bore witness unto itself from the apostles and from the evangelists and important people in the early church. A lot of problems came up, and how the Catholic Church responded to those problems helped that universality. The problems kept coming up too, really from the Roman Empire. And there were several emperors who were, to different degrees, bent on persecuting early Christians and restoring the old pagan rites that had seen Rome through many prosperous decades, centuries that maybe kind of waned. After the first millennium or so, successive splits, schisms, and divisions begin to appear in Catholic tradition. Firstly, and maybe mainly, is the split with the Orthodox Christians in the East. That's about in the 11th century. A few hundred years later begins the Reformation and the tumult of splitting that happens with that into Protestantism in Europe. Lutheranism, Calvinists, Anglicans, and other sects of Christianity break away from Catholicism, leaving Christendom, as it was called, divided. Catholicism remains, however, to this day, Christianity's largest single organization and arguably its most influential. Now these statistics are about 10 years old. I probably should take a wheel at getting a little bit more updated data, but it'll give you a general sense of it, a shirt size of it here. There are approximately 1.4 billion Catholics in the world, people who would identify as Catholic. That's about 20% of the global population, maybe a little less. Vatican City, by the way, is a independent country. It's in the smack middle of Rome, the city, but Vatican City is a nation on this planet, and it is, by percentage, the highest percent populous Catholic country at 100%. 850 out of 850 of its residents are Catholic. The Americas, that is the largest percentage Catholic continent at about 65% Catholic. That's Central and South America. The largest countries by number of Catholics: Brazil, number 1, Mexico, number 2, the Philippines, the United States of America, and Italy make the 5. I think Brazil has something like 130 million Catholics, Mexico about 100 million, and it sort of shoots down from there. That's a broad first introduction to Catholicism and what Catholicism is. We will pick up from here in our next video with more of a detailed historical overview of the Catholic Church before we get into how Catholics are different from other Christians and the distinguishing features of Catholicism. And we'll continue on this train down the track until after watching this series, you can say that maybe you have a Bronx Kids understanding of the Catholic Church.